Hello, so today we are going to talk about Chapter 5, which is lipids. We're going to talk about fatty acids, especially a little bit about triglycerides, review some about phospholipids, and then talk about sterols just a little bit. So you will notice, if you look at your PowerPoint from Moodle, I did delete some slides for this video, just some things that we don't necessarily need to cover for the sake of time. So if you do notice that any are deleted, that was purposeful, and you will not be tested on it. So we know that lipids are generally insoluble in water, but we have organic solvents that are able to solubilize them. So this is why our digestive process is so important, and our digestive secretions are so important in helping us to be able to digest and metabolize the lipids that we consume. So in this chapter, like I said, we're going to talk about fatty acids and triglycerides most importantly. Let's see. So we all know that lipids, or the fatty acids that we consume, definitely provide us with a lot of calories, but there's way more function to the lipids that we consume or that we create in our body. So we actually can store a ton of energy in the form of triglycerides in the body. An adult male can go up to like 100,000 calories. But we've always learned, insulation, padding, and protection are important functions. But we're going to talk about later on how essential fatty acids work in the body and why they're necessary. We've talked a little bit about the phospholipid bilayer, which is an important function, so that creates the cellular membranes. We talked about how cholesterol helps to form the structure in the cellular membranes. And then we're also going to discuss the steroid molecules and where those come from. So there's lots of different functions for lipids than what we kind of see with the naked eye. Okay, so you're going to do an activity with the lipid nomenclature worksheet, so you should cover most of this. Make sure you read, let me find it in the book really quick. Okay, that'll be on pages 112 through 114, the lipid nomenclature section. So if you have any questions about this, just let me know. Like I said, you'll cover this in that assignment. Oh, I did want to point out, let me see where I wrote this. This in your book, if you're looking at table 5.1 on page 113, this is the same chart. This linoleic acid right here should read omega-6, so W6, not 3. Okay, so we know we have saturated, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated fatty acids. This just is determined by whether or not there's that double bond and if there's more than one double bond. This is important for us to know because the fatty acid saturation and how long that fatty acid chain actually is really influences how easily it's able to be solubilized, the polarity of it, and then even the melting point. So this goes back to like if you have, a brick of butter versus, some olive oil, there's going to be big differences, and that's because one is highly saturated, one is highly unsaturated, and then those chain links are going to differ as well. Okay, so we know we can consume fatty acids through lots of different foods. We're going to talk about that. But we can actually synthesize fatty acids as well. This is primarily going to happen in our liver and in our adipose tissue, but it can also happen within the kidneys, mammary glands, lungs, and brain. But like I said, the liver and the adipose tissue are going to be where this is occurring most likely, or most often, with the liver being more predominant. So there is a diagram on the next slide that's going to explain this a little bit more, but keep in mind that acetyl coenzyme A right here is your building block for fatty acid synthesis, and then your acetyl coenzyme A carboxylase and then your fatty acid synthase are our regulatory enzymes. So those are what's going to keep things moving, whether it's going to slow down or speed up. but we have to have acetyl coenzyme A to be able to kick it off in the first place. So there are some videos that I uploaded on Moodle from Khan Academy that are going to go into this in much more detail, and they do a very good job, so I like it. But just to kind of start off here, we said that acetyl coenzyme A is the building block. So first off, we have to form malonyl coenzyme A from acetyl coenzyme A. So we have our acetyl coenzyme A, and we're creating malonyl coenzyme A. Then in our second step here in this box, we have our malonyl coenzyme A, but we're attaching another acetyl coenzyme A. So we're essentially building here. All right, and you see where this malonyl coenzyme A right here, this is where our fatty acid chain is going to start to build. Okay, so if you come onto this step 3 box, if you go all the way down, you see this is what's attached to that condensing enzyme and the carrier protein, and now our chain is really, it's getting much longer. Okay, so we've had, our malonyl coenzyme A attaching and attaching and attaching and attaching, and then we have this long chain. So essentially this is how fatty acids are created within the body. Okay, so our fatty acid synthesis can be upregulated or downregulated based on physiological happenings of the moment. So think about insulin. When is insulin higher in our blood? It's going to be in those times whenever we have high blood glucose, which means we have room for reserves. Okay, so if we have room for reserves, we're going to want to pack that into our adipocytes, right? So we're going to increase fatty acid synthesis whenever we have all that extra energy floating around. Citrate's also important. If we have a lot of citrate in the cytosol, we're going to upregulate fatty acid synthesis. And citrate is something that they really explain well in that video that I mentioned that I added on Moodle. So we're going to decrease fatty acid synthesis when glucagon is present in large amounts. Remember, glucose is gone whenever we have glucagon. So we don't have all of this free energy floating around to create fatty acids. So we want to reserve energy, and we're not going to be making fatty acids. We're going to be pulling energy, not creating energy. Okay, so 2 other things beyond fatty acid synthesis is fatty acid elongation and fatty acid desaturation. So think about it like this. There's lots of different fatty acids that we can consume, right? There's some fatty acids that we can create from fatty acids that we consume, but that we don't maybe consume in adequate amounts. So that's why we have fatty acid elongation and fatty acid desaturation. We can create different fatty acids that have different purposes in the body from fatty acids that we consume or fatty acids that we synthesize in our body. So elongation, think these are just going to make longer fatty acid chains. This can happen in the ER or in the mitochondria. It's going to use malonyl coenzyme A again to increase the length of the fatty acid, right? So it's providing those carbon units. Fatty acid elongase, those are the enzymes that help with catalyzing these reactions to elongate the fatty acids. And then we have fatty acid desaturation, which essentially is to help make more double bonds, right? So our unsaturated fatty acids have at least one double bond. So with fatty acid desaturases, we can create more double bonds with longer fatty acid chains. So if you'll see here, you have a desaturase, a delta 6 desaturase, and a delta 9 desaturase. So that just means that this specific enzyme works on that delta 6 carbon. So you'll notice in your book, we don't have an enzyme that helps us to desaturate beyond this 9th delta carbon. And that is important because of if we were able to, then the fatty acids that have double bonds beyond that delta 9 carbon, we wouldn't have to consume them in our diet, right? We would be able to elongate and desaturate ourselves in adequate amounts. But that's not the case. So that means that we have to consume this linoleic acid and linolenic acid in our diet, and those are our essential fatty acids. I've mentioned the pentose phosphate pathway a couple times. Again, we're not going to go into a lot of depth with it, but I do want to call to mind what you see here with NADP reducing to NADPH. This is what is kind of essential to the rest of physiology and how it interacts with other metabolic processes. All right, so cis and trans fatty acids. Cis, the hydrogen bonds are on the same side. Our trans hydrogen atoms are on opposite sides. So think of it, if they're on the same side, they're able to move a little bit more fluid within the body. But if they're on opposite sides, it makes it more structurally sound, right? So they're going to be more rigid and not be able to move. They're less fluid. So that's kind of what causes these impacts within the body whenever we consume large amounts of trans fatty acids. And you can see those here. Okay, so again with our essential fatty acids, linoleic and linolenic acid, this is where I've written that, so this is where it's wrong in your chart. But they're very important for growth and reproduction, essentially. So right here, we can see that we can create other fatty acids from our linoleic and our linolenic acid. All right, so this one might look familiar. It's DHA. Okay, so EPA and DHA are crucial within the diet. I'm sure you've heard that, especially with pregnancy and for growth and development. Fish is a good source of EPA and DHA, and it is notable to say that we do need to consume adequate amounts of EPA and DHA from the diet, because we don't do a great job of synthesizing EPA and DHA from our essential fatty acids. It can happen, but just not at the equivalence needed for growth and development. So this just goes on to explain that. Okay, this is back to nomenclature. Okay, so our triglycerides, this can be any form of food fat or body fat. So this is kind of a misconception. We think triglycerides are just in our blood, but it's actually the stored form of fat in the food fat too. So triglycerides can be, these can appear as monoglycerides or diglycerides, but triglycerides is how we see them most often. So here you have your glycerol and your 3 fatty acids, and together this is making your triglyceride. So this is your glycerol backbone, and then fatty acid, and fatty acid. Phospholipids we've talked a lot about with structural support in that cellular membrane. This is basically what it is. So you have your glycerol backbone, your 2 fatty acid tails, and then your phosphate group. Oops. Okay, sterols are important because of their relation to our steroid hormones. Our steroid hormones, especially our estrogens, androgens, our adrenocorticoid hormones, and then cholesterol as well. Cholesterol itself is so important because we have so many biologically important cholesterol derivatives. Okay, so our bile acids, our vitamin D, progesterone, all of these are here in thanks to cholesterol. So cholesterol is absolutely necessary in the body, and we actually are able to synthesize it. We are able to synthesize about 700 milligrams a day just to kind of put that into perspective. I believe an egg is like 190, definitely less than 200 milligrams. So it's a good bit of cholesterol that we're able to synthesize, and that is because there are so many important derivatives of cholesterol, and they are necessary for proper function.